Hello everybody. I am Mark Newman, professor at University of Michigan. So you get back-to-back Michigan people, go blue. As Vivek said when he introduced me, I'll be talking about some of the technical considerations. My background is computer science. I have an appointment in computer science and the School of Information, and I've worked in sort of different areas. I'm not quite new to mHealth anymore, but newish. I have worked in other areas of like smart home control and sustainability, consumer electronics type applications, and some other things like that. But this was great. Vivek asked me to put together this presentation, and it gave me an opportunity to really reflect on what I have learned through working on a number of these projects over the last 5 to 10 years, including a project I'm working on right now with Vivek, and other projects with other people who you will be meeting or have you already heard from today. And so, let's see. So you're here because you're interested in mHealth, and especially after seeing Billy's talk, you're thinking, this is really great stuff. This is exciting. I want to get in there and I want to deploy my mHealth intervention. I want to test my idea and I want to get it out there. I want to run a study. And now you've got a lot of decisions to make. If you're talking about mHealth, are you going to support iOS, Android, or both? What kind of technology, what kinds of user interactions are you going to be using? Are you going to use EMA, ecological momentary assessments, push notifications, SMS, text notifications, JEDI functionality where you're sending prompts to people at the right time? What's your study design going to be? How are you going to build this? Are you going to build it? Are you going to buy it? Are you going to use a platform that gives you most of the functionality? Where are you going to host it? Are you going to be using other devices? All of these kinds of things, right? So there's a lot of decisions to make. And what you decide in one area will constrain what you can do in other areas. So where do you start? Of course, you start with your science, right? So what are your core research questions? What is it that you want to learn? And from there, you need to think about, well, what are the absolutely essential ingredients of this intervention package that I want to put together? What is the thing that I am going to try to change about the user's environment, their behavior? Well, what am I going to try to change that will trigger a change in their behavior or in their health or something like that? What's your study design? What kind of methodology are you going to be using to answer these questions? What are you going to be measuring and how are you going to do that? And then what other pieces of information are you going to want to collect to help you understand the relationship between the interventions and the outcomes? So your mediators and moderators and so forth. And so I'm going to just give a couple of sort of high-level examples. These are both based on projects that I've had some involvement with. So you might have a question like, do recommendations for mindfulness promoting activities such as guided meditation videos reduce anxiety and or pain pre and post surgery for patients? Or you might have a research question like, do contextually tailored activity suggestions and anti-sedentary messages increase physical activity both proximally and distally across some period of time? And so starting from that, you kind of play it out and say, well, what, for the first one, for mindfulness promoting activities, what would be some of the essential intervention ingredients to be able to answer this question? So if you're providing recommendations, presumably you're doing this over time, you're doing this in the context of people's lives. That's what makes it mHealth. So you need to have some kind of messaging you're going to be delivering to people, and you need to have access to content, the video content that they're going to view. You might decide that the way you want to do this is through a randomized control trial. So you're going to compare people who are receiving the intervention against people who are receiving usual care. Your outcome measures in this case might well be self-reported pain and anxiety. So you need to think about how you're going to collect those measures. Are you going to collect them continuously, just pre and post, et cetera? In this case, since you're talking about pre and post surgery, there's at least a couple of time points, but you might also be interested in how these individual recommendations affect these things, which would increase the frequency. You might be interested in mediators and moderators, such did people actually engage with the intervention? So did their level of engagement have an impact? You would assume that it very well might, and have an impact on the amount of benefit that they received. Did they engage with the content? Did they watch the whole video? Did they return to videos? All of these kinds of things you might want to collect. So then you need to think, well, what does this mean for my intervention development, right? Well, if we have a messaging component, we need to have some technology that can deliver messages, presumably on some kind of schedule or randomly or whatever, but it has to deliver them, and it has to deliver them without somebody sitting there and pushing a button or sending text messages. Access to content. Well, where are you going to host this content? Are you going to have to put together a server, put the video library on it? Are you going to put it on a commercial service like YouTube and organize it into a channel? Those kinds of things. And in each of those cases, how do these two things fit together? How does the message allow the person to get to the content, and so forth? For the study design, self-reported pain and anxiety, if you want to be collecting this on a continuous basis, you need to think about how you're going to let people answer questions using EMA. And then also questions like, well, okay, what's happening in the control group? Are we going to collect continuously? Do we need to build two separate systems? These kinds of things. If you're interested in whether things like engagement impact the benefits or how people interact with the system, then you need to think about, well, how are we going to track these interactions? If we want to know, for example, and this was something that actually came up in this study, how much of a video somebody watched, how are we going to track that? You can't get that from YouTube, right? If you just let people go to a YouTube channel and do their thing, you don't know which participant watched how much of a video. You can see how much in aggregate people watched and what the sessions were, but you can't connect those two together. So you might have to build something, or you might have to use a service that allows you to track that kind of thing. In the example of, this is heart steps, which some of you might be familiar with, but do contextually tailored activity suggestions and anti-sedentary messages increase physical activity. Here again, we're going to be sending activity suggestions to people. We're going to need some kind of messaging component. Here, because one of our questions is about contextual tailoring, and what I mean by that is just having messages that are relevant to particular contexts, like the weather is nice, the weather is crappy, it's morning, it's evening, it's weekend, you're at home, you're at work, those kinds of things. If you want to have that kind of capability, you need to detect those signals from people, right? You need to say, well, okay, what are the things that we can actually know about somebody's context that we can use to tailor the messages that they receive? If we wanted to do the anti-sedentary messages as they did in Heart Steps, where people actually receive messages when they are being sedentary, we need to be able to detect sedentary episodes. And there may be intervention ingredients that are sort of actually not our primary research interest, but help to provide a context in which things like these messages might make sense, such as goal setting and feedback around physical activity. So giving people the goal of how much physical activity, how many steps to get, and then giving them suggestions for how to do it, right? So there might be components that you are developing that are not necessarily part of your core research question, but are important for creating the context in which you can explore them. In this case, the study design was an MRT, and that's driven by the fact that there was interest in knowing what the proximal effect of those messages was, in addition to the long-term effect of the intervention. The outcome measure here, since we're looking at increasing physical activity, that it's got to be some measure of physical activity, and there's a bunch of things that we might be interested in collecting as well. So these have implications. Again, we need to think about our message delivery. We need to think about what our contextual data sources are. In this case, you might think, well, how important is each one and how expensive is it to get, right? Weather is pretty easy to get. The person's location is more challenging. It's there, but there's privacy concerns, there's battery life concerns, various other concerns that you need to take into consideration. And other things like that. So a lot of these imply that we need to be using a wearable activity tracker to collect these activity measures. That's important for the outcome measures. It's important for the goal setting and feedback component. It's necessary for detecting the, sedentary episodes. And if we wanted to use a potential mediator or moderator, like activity preceding message receipt, did this impact the likelihood that they got activity afterwards, we would need to do that as well. And so these are the kinds of things that you kind of need to think through. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that you need to be pretty clear, and as you see as we go through the rest of this, you need to be pretty clear about what's really important, what you really need to do before making those decisions about how you're going to build this thing, right? And that's tough because you got to write the grant, like way in advance and stuff like that. But there's a lot of considerations that will come into play, and we'll talk more about that as we go. So there's a lot of choices for platforms, and here we're just talking about kind of the basic building blocks. So we could think about the software platforms. So we'll talk about commercial software. So in some cases there might be an app that's already in existence that allows you to answer the questions that you want, and then you don't have to build anything. And that's great. That's relatively rare, but it can happen. We'll look at some examples. We'll look at research platforms. So these are platforms that ostensibly allow you to build an entire research study, including intervention and data collection, with little to no technical effort on your part. And then there's custom software that you build yourself or work with an external firm to build. And then a lot of cases you might have hybrids where you're using some combination of commercial software, apps from the App Store, research platforms, and custom code. And then on the hardware side, this is mHealth, so we're kind of assuming in most cases that there's a smartphone involved, but there might be other sensors that are connecting in various ways. So smartwatches, activity trackers, specialized medical devices like glucometers and blood pressure cuffs, and so on and so forth. So we think about all of these things. So commercial software, again, if depending on your research question, you might be interested in knowing, for example, well, does activity tracking and feedback provide benefits for this particular population, right? In that case, you might have a research question that has not been answered. Does giving people a Fitbit and the Fitbit app that meet certain criteria give benefits to those people? If that's not something that we know, that might be a study that needs to be done, right? And if that's the case, you might think about whether you could just use the existing software that's out there. And here are just several examples. As one kind of example that's going on right now, or very soon to be going on, is a study that I am involved in, where we're looking at whether an AI-based agent can improve quality of life for informal caregivers of individuals with dementia. And this is really kind of a precursor. It's an exploratory study at this point to kind of feel out, the potential benefits of this kind of approach for this population, towards the interest of then developing more sort of substantial research questions, research proposals, and potentially software where we package AI agents in different ways. And we want to know, well, what works and what doesn't with the existing sort of cutting edge applications that already exist in this space. So we're looking at this application called EarKick, which is an AI sort of mental health coach, broadly speaking, where you interact with your coach, Dr. Panda, and it has a bunch of features where you can ask it questions and it can give you suggestions and things like that. And so we're going to give this to a number of informal care providers. We're going to have them do daily check-ins. They report to us what experiences they had interacting with the Panda. And then the primary data of interest is going to come in end of study interviews, where we talk to them about the specific experiences that they reported in their daily feedback, and figure out, where did this approach work for them? Where did it provide support? Where did it miss? Where did it feel like it understood them? Where did it feel like it didn't understand them? And from that, try to understand, okay, well, what if we were going to build specific AI-based interventions for this population, which features do we need to provide? Which features are missing that we would need to add? And how could we design them so that they're more focused in this particular area? Now, it's worth noting that even in this case where we're using commercial software, we're having to build some other infrastructure around it because we're going to be sending people messages, reminders to interact with the app, recommendations for how to interact with the app. So there's different features of EarKick, some of which we don't really want people to waste time on, and some of which we do. So we're interested in the routines feature, where you work with the Panda to develop essentially new routines for building habits. These might be things around exercise. These might be things around mindfulness. This might be things around social connection. And we want to try to understand how that feature might provide benefits and where it might fall short. We're also using Qualtrics for collecting pre-post measures and things like that. So the advantage of using a commercial software, if you can get away with it, if your research question will support it, is that by and large, these are going to be they're very motivated to make sure that they work, make sure that the user experience is at least reasonable, they're professionally maintained, they're going to fix bugs, they're going to handle changes to operating systems. So the new version of iOS comes out, they're going to be making sure that it works with that, and so on and so forth. And so from the researcher perspective, this can be very cost effective, little to no development effort. You might have to pay for premium services or something like that, as we're having to do with EarKick, but it's not going to be a lot compared to other approaches. Now, disadvantages, there can be, their priorities are not yours, right? They may decide to remove features that you were actually counting on for your study. They may change the way that things work. And you have no control over that. You may not even know that it's coming, and it can just come in and it can potentially disrupt your study. Often functionality isn't exactly what you need, even if it's close. So as an example, the Garmin app has adaptive step goals. It changes step goals every day, and if you're doing a physical activity intervention, that may not be the step goal recommendation algorithm that you would have chosen for yourself. A lot of times apps may have a certain functionality that you are interested in for your research, but they have a bunch of other stuff that you might not be interested in that could just create noise, can disrupt the user experience, or actually sort of distract people from the phenomenon that you're interested in studying. So like the Fitbit app, for example, has stuff for they've got nutrition tracking, and they've got sleep tracking, and they've got mindfulness and all kinds of stuff like that. And if you're doing physical activity intervention, you might not be interested in all of that stuff. You may need to combine multiple commercial tools to cover needed functionality, and then you're increasing complexity for participants. In that case, you could have things where you have feature duplication. So I've been involved in a study before where we used Fitbit and MyFitnessPal, and we didn't really realize this was going to happen, but users were confused because they do a lot of the same things. A big issue can be, what data can you actually get, right? Can you actually get the data that you're interested in from the commercial app? So if you're doing a study with Fitbit and you are interested in people's step counts based on the usage, are you able to get that, right? And the answer in that case is yes, there are ways to do it. There's an API. There's an ability for participants to download their data, so that increases the complexity to the user and the likelihood of some kind of error, but that's a way to get it. but there are many cases where the data that you might be interested in, you can't get. Moving on, I imagine many of you are familiar with and have probably interacted with various research platforms. So these range from specific platforms that support a particular function like Qualtrics that's really focused on surveys and survey delivery. They do provide some additional tools such as support for text messaging and sending things out, and some logic that you could construct that you could use to build aspects of an intervention. So I'm including it here along with these other platforms, and I've only just picked a few of them. There's many out there. At this point, there's probably a couple dozen that do different sort of slices through the space of mobile health studies. A lot of them are primarily focused on data collection. So they might provide excellent support for EMA and integrating sensor data and participant registration and all of these kinds of things. But they weren't necessarily built with intervention delivery in mind, even though people have adapted them in certain ways. Pathverse is actually an exception to that. It is more intervention focused. If their model works for you, that's great, but it's got a specific model, as all of these things do. They are going to have sort of, and it may not be easy to tell from the outside, from their marketing materials and things like that, what use cases they really are designed to support and which ones they could do, but it's not really their wheelhouse, and you might run into a bunch of issues that you hadn't anticipated because you're kind of going outside of the safe zone of what they normally do. So common features that you can get from these kinds of platforms, which are a huge deal, and not to be taken lightly. Participant management, so enrolling people, managing, withdrawing people, terminating participation, authentication on various platforms, data collection and storage, the ability to, in many cases, build surveys using drag and drop kinds of tools, ability to do notifications in various formats, push, SMS, email, and so forth. Providing a client, a mobile client in most cases, that's already cross-platform, that's going to be updated for different OS releases and things like that. So taking a lot of headaches out that you would otherwise have to deal with. Many of them have some support for customizing the user experience that might be as limited as picking the different colors, but might be as sophisticated as defining different navigation flows through the application screens and things like that. Some support for defining your intervention logic. So being able to define schedules, so doing scheduled like push notification delivery, filtering patients or filtering participants in different ways so different groups get different functionality and those kinds of things. Some of them even will have an API, an application programming interface, that will allow you to write custom code to extend the functionality beyond what they provide in their sort of graphical user interface builder type environment. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about an example of this. So this is a study, My BP My Life, and its successor, My BP My Life 2, which is just going out into the field now. So this is a physical activity and low sodium diet intervention for patients with hypertension. And we built this on top of Care Evolution's My Data Helps platform. I imagine some of you may have some experience with that. Participants were given a Fitbit and an Omron. So Fitbit and an Omron blood pressure self-monitoring cuff that connects to the phone via Bluetooth. Interesting side note about that is that in order for those devices to connect and provide data that can then be brought into the My Data Helps environment, they had to also install and set up accounts for and enable the Omron Connect app, and the Fitbit app. So we actually had to get 3 apps set up on people's phones and make sure that they were all working and they had accounts. They were all talking to each other. So that's a typical kind of thing, and not something that we maybe totally realized until we were getting closer to delivering it. In this case, we used the platform, but we built the user interface from scratch. So we built a complete web app that's rendered within the My Data Helps app environment. We used various tools that they provided to get data in and out. But all the data, the research data, was stored on their servers and hosted by them. We used various features, their survey builders and tasks and their notifications. And important to note, because we quickly realized that we were going beyond the capabilities that they provided sort of self-service through their platform, we worked closely with a developer at their organization who was more or less, assigned to us, who developed a lot of the back-end code for us because they didn't have tools to be able to do that. And most notably, they didn't have the ability to do mRT designs because they didn't have the ability to randomize intervention delivery, right? You could schedule it. You could say every day at 3 o'clock, this participant, these participants get this kind of a message. But the ability to randomize that or to randomize which message they got, things like that, was not built into the platform. And so we had to work with one of their internal developers to do it. I think in part motivated by that, they then built an API. So the next time we came back to them and said, hey, we're going to do another version of this, can we work with Vlad again? They were like, no, but you could build it yourself. And so they gave us the documentation, and we were able to do that. So in this case, we built a sort of decision rule engine, or just not an engine, that kind of glorifies it too much, but a program that runs in AWS Lambda, which is a serverless approach to running code that is triggered either by, there's different ways to trigger it. In this case, it was triggered by a scheduler that ran once a minute and woke the algorithm up, and it would go get a bunch of data from My Data Helps, do the processing and do the randomization, decide who was going to get what message, and then use the REST API to tell My Data Helps to send which message to whom. And this was, so this was a lift, but it was within the scope of something that a master's student was able to do. And so that is, not necessarily the case with some of these build from scratch mobile health interventions, where you need somebody who's got a little bit more experience, who's got some experience specifically with software architecture, with thinking about all of these different parts interacting with each other and so forth. No shade to any master's level software developers on this call. So some advantages here. If you're working with one of these research platforms, so as noted, you get this robust delivery platform, an app that another entity is motivated to keep working. You get a set of already integrated data feeds to just kind of pick from. So you can say, oh yeah, I want Fitbit and Omron and Apple Watch, and but as long as they've built the support for it, you can use it. They have tools that makes a lot of standard things that you need to do easy. Standard surveys, if they're not too fancy or tricky or dynamic, the tools will allow you to build those. Some support for scheduling and sending various kinds of notifications, typically on a fixed schedule. Standard, so some user-facing widgets, or ability to display data. So if it's a common use case, like showing somebody's progress towards a goal, like steps, today versus the step count goal for today, they will provide a standard sort of bar chart widget that lets you do that kind of thing. and they'll provide some tools for participant monitoring, being able to see who's responded to which surveys and things like that. So if your needs are relatively standard in a particular type of research, these platforms will have already built support for it. But once you start going outside those bounds, you may find that the platforms actually constrain you in ways that are that can hamper the research that you want to do. Some of them will, in addition to providing the tools, in fact, many of them offer consulting and development to customize beyond what the tool offers. So like I talked about with our experience with Care Evolution, we had an inside guy who could make changes and set stuff up for us. But that cost money, right? We had to pay for that. It's not free. And that can really rack up quickly. And so, as I said, if you don't push the envelope too much, it might be just fine. And you can do a lot, and really the capabilities are growing all the time. So the disadvantages, of course, they do what they do, and they don't do what they don't do. Now, I'm probably not a standard case here, but I have yet to do a study where we didn't have to write any code. And I've done several studies with this platform and a couple of other ones. So I think that the promise of a one-size-fits-all turnkey solution where, without writing any code, you could create these interventions and run these studies is maybe a little oversold, at least in my experience. So if you have the platform engineers, within the platform, make changes that can be unexpected costs if you didn't think about them pretty carefully in advance. The integrations that they have, like especially with like sensor devices and things like that, or if they have other data sources that they integrate with, or can they talk to your your institution's EHR, or do they integrate with REDCap or whatever? Those questions are going to be based on their business roadmap. And if they don't see that that's something that they would get value from doing, it's not going to happen. And the specific example that came up here was working with My Data Helps. The low sodium diet aspect of this intervention was intended to be based on another study called Low Salt for Life that Mike Dorsch in pharmacy here at the University of Michigan had previously built. And the logic behind that intervention was that you would use location to detect when people were going into locations where they would be making dietary choices, like grocery stores, restaurants, and things like that. And that was the core kind of intervention novelty. We tried to look at how to integrate that into My Data Helps platform, and they don't allow GPS. They don't allow location tracking. And they made it very clear that they talked about it a lot, and they had decided it was never going to be part of their platform, in part because they're distributing an app called My Data Helps on the App Store, and that's how your participants will be interacting with it. And any feature like that they add has to then become part of the I forget what the permissions that every user has to grant when downloading it. So even if you're running a study that's just a survey where you're asking people 10 questions or once a week or something like that, it will ask them to enable the location capability, right? And so I could understand why they made that decision, but it meant that a whole research question and a whole aspect of our study we just weren't able to do, right? And so that's a constraint that you may run into. You have less control over the user experience. It feels different, and this may or may not matter to the type of research that you do. But like in the case of My BP My Life, we were interested in building an app, and we're planning to deploy it in Flint, Michigan, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Flint is a low SES, predominantly African American community. Ann Arbor is relatively affluent and relatively white. And we did a bunch of participatory research early on in Flint. And one of the things that we learned was that there was a fair amount of skepticism. I think this is well known, but we learned it also, that skepticism of the medical establishment, of researchers wanting to come and make life better for people in Flint. And we had community partners, and we were talking about different ways to sort of brand this application and introduce it to people. But at the end of the day, it was going to be an app called My Data Helps, and there was nothing we could do about it, even though this was an intervention and it wasn't primarily about, the messaging wasn't around give us your data so you can help science, which is kind of what their core model is. So it's a long-winded way of saying you have limited control over things like the branding, the way that they first get introduced to these things, the user interface, just at the low level and the high level, you are constrained by what they're going to be providing, and things like that. And so there are limitations that you have to accept. And these platforms, or anybody that you work with external to your team, they don't know your research, right? And they don't know exactly, the methods that you need to use, what your data requirements are, what your population is, and things like that. So they haven't built the platform necessarily to solve your particular problem. So that takes us to the third approach, which is the build it yourself approach. Now, of course, this is, you don't have any of these other problems. You can brand it how you like. You can make the UI how you like. You can get the data that you want. But it's going to be, generally speaking, quite a bit more expensive. You have most control over all of the aspects of it compared to the other approaches, but you have to then figure out how you're going to get this thing built. This requires a range of skills. This is not necessarily all of them, but you need things like UI design, like somebody who can actually figure out what this thing should look like and use modern standards and these kinds of things. Different aspects of the technical side of things, so front-end development, back-end development, database management, system administration. These four here, you will often hear referred to as full stack development. And so these are people who at least know something enough to, maybe get something off the ground about all of these different things. So if you're putting out a job, if you're putting a job description together, you might think about something like that. But even when you've decided that you're going to need to build it yourself, none of these platforms are going to work for you. You have a decision to make about whether to build this in-house, basically the team that reports to you, and this might be a team that you would then need to build or put together. So you'd hire developers that work for you, or there's kind of and then the other big approach there would be to work with an external agency, so a software development firm that works with clients and builds to their specification. And then there might be sort of a hybrid in-between approach. Is Rose still here? Which is to work with an entity within your organization that is in some sense a client-based, hey, there's Rose, sort of entity that does maybe this kind of work, does software development. Your organization may or may not have such a thing. You definitely don't have Rose if you're not at UCLA. But this would be kind of a hybrid experience. They might have more experience with doing research in general, more experience with doing research that's similar to what you do, but they're still, they're an external entity in the sense that you still have to figure out, well, how do I explain to them what I'm doing, and how do I figure out if what they're doing is actually what I needed, rather than what I said, because those are often different things. So just another example here, project that I've been involved in. So the project is called MyWaves. This was a personalizing JEDI. Basically, that means it has an RL attached, reinforcement learning attached to it, to help young adults reduce cannabis use. Just high-level features, twice a day EMA followed by randomized intervention message, or randomized whether there was an intervention message, and then randomized among 6 different types of intervention message. This was designed to be an mRT with a proximal outcome of self-reported cannabis use 12 hours within 12 hours after receiving the message. As I mentioned, there was a reinforcement learning that was used to determine whether or not to send a message post EMA based on what the responsiveness of each individual to prior messages in similar contexts, and so forth. We conducted a pilot study with 120 young adults across 30 days, and we're working on those results now. So this was a pretty big project. The team involved behavioral scientists, so people that work in substance abuse prevention and reduction, methodological experts, Billy. We had an RL expert. This was Susan, and her PhD student, Sushaban, who actually implemented the RL. We had a research software engineer, Pei Yao Hung, who basically built the app, although he had a little bit of help and managed a student developer and a student UX designer, both who were paid on an hourly basis. There was at least one statistician, and then there's me, who was, connecting and translating among the various parties and trying to figure out how to get the project done. This took about 2 years. I actually I had trouble reconstructing exactly. It took longer than anyone thought it was going to take, from initiation to the completion of the data collection. And during that time, we had weekly meetings with everybody that's listed here on the left, to the extent that they were able to come. And that the content of those meetings shifted from design to planning and supervising the development to analysis. We did, I can't remember now if it was 2, I think it was 3 rounds of beta testing and then rolling enrollment. I think I'm going to skip some of this. Yeah, you don't need to know the whole architecture. But the advantages, I think, are relatively clear, right? You have control, right? You can do exactly what you need to do within certain constraints. It also allows you to innovate beyond what these platforms might offer if you're kind of out in front of what the standard approaches are and the standard designs are. And I mean, inherently, platforms are always going to lag behind what's possible because they're motivated to take what the common things are that most people are doing and make them easier to do. So if you're trying to do something that's new or a little bit out there, the platforms are going to not make that necessarily easy to do because they're motivated to support the majority of potential customers. In a meeting actually with the CEO of Care Evolution that I was in just a little like a week and a half ago, along with my colleague Peja, who I think most of you have met or will met. I mean, he told us that we were at least a couple standard deviations away from their typical customer in terms of what we were trying to do. And so, that's why we're investing a lot in building up our technical infrastructure to be able to do things. So disadvantages, of course, it's more expensive. Though, as I mentioned, using research platforms can sneak up on you if turns out you need things done that it doesn't necessarily do. Even when you're doing your own custom thing, you're still often reliant on other third-party software constraints. Services for you're not going to build everything yourself, so you might be using like services like Twilio to send text messages or Fitbit to collect sensor data. And a lot of those things we talked about dependency on commercial software, those can come up here too, right? So we've seen examples where Fitbit changes something about their API and it changes the data that you get, and it can cause all kinds of problems. If you're looking at an in-house team, it's not just hiring people, but thinking about how do you actually build and sustain that capacity. So it's not just hiring unless you know how to supervise software developers. You might be looking at building, managing, and maintaining team personnel. How do you retain people? How do you get Depending on what's going on in the economy, it can be relatively easy. It's never easy, but it can be relatively more challenging to hire good software engineers. If you're working externally, communicating is a big challenge, or can be a big challenge. This can be from the day-to-day of trying to explain what I need for this app to do, or what I need this data to look like, and how do I get the person on the other side who doesn't know my research, doesn't know my data, doesn't know what, doesn't know inside my head what I'm trying to do, how do I explain it to them? And then depending on how that relationship is constructed, that can even get to the level of, well, you wrote a contract and said you were going to give this much money for doing, building these features. Now you realize there's something that you needed that wasn't in there, and you got to renegotiate, and you got to figure out, how you're going to do all of those kinds of things. So those could be challenges as well. So the kind of a key message I want to get across here is that, even if you're not building the software from scratch yourself, you are involved in a software development process. I mean, with commercial software, it's a little bit less clear how that is, but you are adding and removing and reshaping aspects of the experience that you want your participants to have. So that means that some of these aspects of development that I'm about to talk about, like testing and prioritizing, are going to be important. So a research platform, even without coding, you're going to be making decisions. You got to figure out if they work, if they make sense, if they give you the data that you need. If you're working with an external contractor, they're doing the software development, they have their process. But one thing I want to stress, and I'll talk a little bit more in the next wrap-up slides here, is that you need to be involved all the way throughout the process. And if you just sort of give a spec sheet and pay them and come back 3 months later, it's very unlikely that you're going to get what you had hoped for. And then obviously, if it's in-house, you're doing software development. So there's kind of different models of software development. And if you haven't, lived in this world, you might think that, this kind of thing works like this. This is kind of like more like how building a building or a ship or an airplane or something like that works, right? Where you work really hard, figure out exactly what the requirements are, come up with a comprehensive design, then you build the thing, then you test it to see if it works, fix any last minute bugs, hopefully nothing big, and then you deploy it, and then after that you maintain it. And this is the way software, still a lot of software is built kind of like this, and even more so in the past, before people started recognizing that this was a really inefficient way of doing things. Because as you go farther along, if you discover that you missed a requirement or you did something wrong, you got something wrong in design, and now you have to fix it in maintenance, it's a lot more expensive and cumbersome than catching it early. So most software development nowadays happens in an iterative fashion, where you'll hear the term agile methodology. That describes a lot of things, and I'll talk about some of the basic principles. But the idea here is that rather than doing a lot of design and development and test, doing those all sequentially, you do little versions of those multiple times, right? So you design it, you build what you can, you do some testing to see what works, what doesn't. It gives people the opportunity to say, boy, that's not what I had in mind at all, right? Actually, what I meant was this. And so then you go back and you say, okay, well, let's design the next version and deploy it and test it and so on and so forth. So in the Agile world, there are several values that have been articulated by some of the early thinkers in this space, and individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software, et cetera. So I'll talk a little bit more about these. And things that you want to think about here is that you want to really think about that, all of the stakeholders who are important to the success of the project are interacting frequently around this, right? So even if you're working with an external firm or you're working with a research platform and they're doing some work for you, you want to be in constant contact and understanding what's happening, seeing results, so that you can learn and pivot as you go. This one probably is not actually great advice for you. As scientists, we often need pretty comprehensive documentation. And also, when you're speaking across disciplines, when you're talking about scientists trying to talk to developers and vice versa, you speak different languages, you make different assumptions. And actually, I found that being very, very explicit is probably closer to what you want to do. An important thing to keep in mind throughout this, the process is that software is all your ideas are always bigger than what you can actually build, right? Software is never complete, but you still have to ship at some point, right? You need to say, this is the thing that we're going to do. So what you need to be thinking about continuously throughout this process is prioritization, right? What are the most important things? You need to ruthlessly and continuously prioritize and make sure that you're working on the things that are the most important. So what are the must-have features for your research? What do you have to have in order for this to be successful? And then you think about, well, what are the most important features for user experience and engagement? Because if it's a bad user experience, it can impact your research goals, right? People didn't fill out your surveys because your surveys sucked and they didn't know where they were or whatever it is, right? Well, that's gonna be bad, right? And then you'll have lots of cool ideas, and your collaborators will have lots of cool ideas for things that you could do, and those go on the list of things that you will do if you have time. There's a sort of little semi-acronym, Moscow, that people talk about, where you think, okay, is this a must-have, a should-have, a could-have, or a won't-have? And then things sort of fall into the won't-have category as you get closer and closer to release. Skip that. I really want to stress this, that testing is fundamental. So during development, you need to be asking, when you're talking about a specific feature, how will we know if this is done, right? Is there a demo? Is there a demo that somebody could do that would convince us that we don't need to worry about this anymore? We can check it off the list and we can move on, right? Because if you don't have that in mind, different people might have different assumptions about the thing, so you say, well, I got the text messaging thing to work, right? Well, that could mean a lot of different things, right? So you need to be much, much more specific and think about what are these concrete tests that everybody will look at and say, okay, yeah, that's good. I want to talk about, so this is a question that you want to ask when you're talking with contractors. How do they do their testing? I had a project where I came into it late and they had already signed the contract, and it turned out testing wasn't part of the contract. So they gave us the software and it hadn't been tested, and you can imagine what happened after that. You want to think about and plan for multiple rounds of field testing where people actually use it. The first is always dog fooding. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but it's a term from the software industry that comes from eating your own dog food. So it's using your own software to see if it works. And I think, I swear by it, it's an absolutely essential part of the process. You need to get everybody using it to see what they can see. You ferret out like the big bugs, big misunderstandings this way. But then you need people who are not so closely tied to it to try it. So I talk about the friends and family deployment, where you go a little bit outside, one hop on your social network, get friends and colleagues or people that owe you a favor to try it out for a few days and give you feedback. And then you need to do beta testing and with members of the target population that have the complete experience of your participants, ideally, with onboarding, with this, filling out the surveys. So these are not your research participants, but this helps you debug the whole system. Another thing that's important is to pilot test the data analysis as you're doing this as well. So you can make sure that the data that you're getting actually serves the needs of the analysis. I've seen it happen way too many times where you get to the end and somebody asks a question and the answer is, we don't have that data. We don't know if people clicked that button, right? We don't know if people responded to the text messages or clicked on the text messages. And just because nobody thought of it in advance, right? And I'm seeing the time, and I know we wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. I do have a couple of pitfalls, and we can share the slides later, but these are just kind of like war wounds here. So don't forget about monitoring. Make sure you know what you're going to get, and don't forget about time zones. Maybe I'll leave it right here with an XKCD cartoon that I probably sent to every team that I've worked with at some point. And that's pretty much it. Talked a little bit more about this is review. I did want to make a plug for a project I'm working on. This whole talk was like the motivation for the Justin framework. So if you're interested, this is basically going to be a toolkit that facilitates the building of custom interventions, and will make the world a better place, but I don't have time to talk about it right now. So I will leave it there, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'll open it up to the scholars, and I can tell you that there is a reason why we have embedded technologists into each team, sometimes two. They will be your BFFs going forward. I cannot tell you how much I have depended upon them to bail me out, as is Mom doing right now. So, questions, Jory?
Hi there. Thanks so much for that great presentation covering so many things. Could you talk a little bit about just integration with electronic health records of external data and some of the do's and don'ts there? We have different stakeholders or interest groups that either want that or don't want that, and so I'm sure we would all learn a lot from just your comments on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean the biggest hurdle there is administrative and not technical. I mean, it's a pain in the ass technically to integrate with Epic and things like that. They don't necessarily make it easy. But the biggest issue is the getting the information assurance and health IT and everybody to sign off on it. And that's a case where you can either sort of do it on your own, or you can find a provider that has already done it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that might be a case where you say, okay, well, we need to work with an external platform that already has a business associate agreement with our university health system or whatever it is that is going to be has the rights to get data in and out of the EHR. I'm not sure if that was a question or if the question was more about like when do you need it, or when do you decide?
Oh no, you answered it. Thank you.
Okay.
Other questions? Madison?
This is even more on the practical side, but like kind of looking at these consumer-based sensors and then the consumer platforms, they all are like embedded in differently. Is there a way to get around the massive headache of paperwork just to see what capabilities the sensors have with the platforms? Having to fill out massive like paperwork on the project, and it's like, I just want to see what data I get out of this platform and your sensor. I don't have 3 hours to write something and 2 more hours to meet with you.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's highly variable. I actually have a meeting with Dexcom later today where we're going through that process, and we don't even know if we want to use their API. We don't even know if it suits our needs. But there isn't. They don't have like a trial version, right? And they put everybody through the same process. I unfortunately I don't know a way around it, because it's one of the down. I mean, the reason that mobile health is appealing, one reason that it's appealing is because it uses this infrastructure that is widely deployed, right? Everybody has a phone. There's all these devices that connect with the phone or connected with the cellular network or something like that. So we're taking advantage of this kind of ubiquitous platform, but then we lose control over all of those aspects of it, right? So we say, oh, this is exciting, we started down the process of trying to get access to the Garmin on-device API, right? And they've got a web API, which is fine if you don't mind only getting data once a day, basically, right? But if you want to get more or less real-time data, you got to go through this other thing, and it's a massive headache, right? And they're not that interested. I mean, research isn't their main motivation, right? They want to make money, they want to sell product, right? And you're going through the same process as the people who want to use their platform to, in some senses, compete with them, right? And they're very, very skittish about this kind of thing. That is potentially an advantage of some of these platforms, right? I mean, so if you look at something like My Data Helps with Care Evolution, they've already done the integration. They have the license with Garmin, and they not the on-device one, but they have figured out some of these hurdles, right? And so then, even if you end up not using it, you can, and I've done this, right? You can try it out with theirs and see what the data looks like. Do you actually get the fields that you need? How fresh is it? All of that kind of stuff, and then you can decide, okay, is this going to actually work for us? So that is potentially a way to get some of it, but it's a difficult space to play in. Yeah.
Catherine?
Hi there. Thanks again for a great talk. I was curious with respect to your MyWaves trial that you mentioned. So thinking about the EMA and RL integration that you're using for informing personalized interventions, I think that's super cool. And I was wondering how you all think about and handle instances of EMA non-response. So like on a given instance, if a person doesn't answer the EMA, what happens then?
Yeah, I mean, that's, as you might imagine, that was the subject of many meetings, as it always is in these kinds of things. And there are different approaches to handling that. I mean, I think, by and large, we would, I mean, one approach, and I actually can't remember which one we ended up with. I think we might have had a hybrid version of this. But, if there's missing data around, so if you're talking about like an MRT analysis, right, and there's a decision point where you don't have the data because the sensor failed, they didn't report the EMA. There are techniques for just removing that from the analysis, right? So then you report, okay, this many data points with missingness of this kind, of that kind, and so on and so forth, and our analysis is based on the resulting set of those. There's still challenges, right? If we were using the EMA, also to do the, that was the proximal outcome for the previous decision point, so then you got to handle that situation. There are solutions to this. There's no like one gold standard for this, but it's an interesting and important question, and something that you do need to think about. Yeah.
Great. We'll take one last question. Jason?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. This is Jason from USC, South Carolina. So I'm just wondering, based on your talk, even the developing or selecting the platform itself could be very tedious.
Mhm.
And then consider like the usual, bigger grant that's 4 to 5 years. If things doesn't work well, that's going to jeopardize a lot in terms of the timeline to your proposal, right? So what would be your suggestion? Should we have like everything ready to make sure the platform and app are ready to go before we apply those bigger grants? And then just a very quick, another short question: how do privacy issue usually being tackled? I know some of the app are actually stored out of US based on the company. So what are the considerations there? Thank you.
Okay, so I think I heard 3 questions. One is, how do you plan, basically, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, there's another issue also, which is that, the time between when you write the proposal and you get it funded, even in the best case, is non-trivial. And then the time before you actually launch the study, and a lot can have changed in that period of time, right? I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but especially maybe less so with some of the big research platforms, but any of these companies or devices or services can go away, right? They could just cease to exist. They could stop supporting the thing that you wanted to do, and so on and so forth. So actually, I don't think that, I think there's often a difference between what you say you're going to do in the grant and what you actually do, right? What you really need to budget for, what you really need to be able to plan for, is how long will it take to do this thing that we wanted to do, and how much do we think it's going to cost, right? But the actual decision for what to do is better made when you have all the information about what your resources are, what your timeline actually is, and what is available now, right? The version of Fitbit that you said you were going to buy is no longer sold, so you got to pivot to something else, right? So it is challenging, right? But what you could do is you can sort of do estimates based on different platforms, right? Okay, what would it be if we did it here? What would it be if we did it there? What would it be if we did it ourselves? And then try to come to something that where you feel like, okay, I think if we have this timeline and this set of resources, we'll be able to do it. I don't know exactly how yet, but we'll figure that out when we get there. Privacy, it's very important. There's a couple of answers to that, and I'll just maybe give a couple. But like, for example, in mHTI, and this is not true of every project I've done, but there was no PII in the server that we built, right? Everybody just had like their study ID. It happened to be an intervention where we didn't have to use their name or any personal information about them. So even though it was a personalized intervention, the intervention actually didn't really know anything about them personally, except for whether they responded to messages and I guess how much marijuana they smoked every day. So that's one approach. The platforms like Care Evolution, Qualtrics, and things of this ilk. This is something they have built in, and it's a question that you want to ask right up front. So what do you do with PII? How do you protect it, et cetera, et cetera? But that's bread and butter for them, so they're going to have quality answers to that. I think your last question was about licensing and things outside the United States. And I have to say I know very little about that. I have not really done studies that go outside the U.S. And so I'm not sure what considerations there are there, but it's a great question, and definitely should be on the checklist of things to make sure you've thought about. Are people going to be using this outside the U.S. and what are the implications?
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Right. Well, thank you very much.